So let's examine our research questions in the context of creating these relative frequency tables. You might say, what percentage of passengers didn't survive? So you could just create a relative frequency table of percentages. In terms of the question, what proportion of passengers were in the upper class? You could, for example, create a relative frequency table of proportions, or maybe you want percentages if you want to display that to an audience who might understand percentages more than proportions. In terms of the other research question, how many women were on the Titanic, you might create a frequency table of counts. So you can see that these research questions are quite easily answered through a collection of data and then this kind of basic analysis where you create a table of counts, proportions, or percentages. Now, besides tables, it's often useful to visualize a categorical variable. So to really visualize a single categorical variable, it's very common to either use a bar graph or a pie chart. Bar graph is usually preferred by statisticians. A pie chart is thought to be somewhat misleading. A bar graph, which we'll talk about in just a second, a bar graph shows the bars whose areas are representing the count of observations for each category of a categorical variable. A pie chart, it basically shows how a whole is divided into categories, and it shows wedges of a circle, and each wedge has an area corresponding to the proportions for each category. So let's look at a bar graph of surviving Titanic. This is a bar graph of counts, so it's a frequency bar graph. And I've presented the frequency table for comparison, and you can see that the bar graph just duplicates the findings from the frequency table, but sometimes it's useful just to visualize the difference, especially to really understand the differences between the number of observations in each category. So the bar graph clearly shows that we have more people who did not survive the Titanic than those who did survive the Titanic. Here's a pie chart for surviving the Titanic. It's similar, so it shows that it's based on a frequency table of counts, but the wedges give you an idea of the relative proportion or percentage. And so you can see that replicating the bar graph of frequency counts, you do see that more people did not survive the Titanic than did survive the Titanic. Now, if you talk to statisticians, they typically don't like pie charts. Now, you might ask why that is, because you see pie charts everywhere. The reason pie charts are somewhat frowned upon among statisticians, especially those who are experts in visualizing data, is that with a pie chart, it can be very difficult to compare group sizes. And the idea is that you don't really have a common benchmark. So in a bar graph, you can really easily compare the heights of the bars. With the pie chart, it can be pretty difficult to really compare the relative sizes, especially when the categories are pretty similar, the number of counts or the relative size of the counts, meaning the proportions or percentages. So I just want to emphasize that if you're showing a table of counts or frequencies to a statistician or an expert in data visualization, you should probably present a bar graph. So let's just examine this. So this is a bar graph of the counts for the different passenger classes on the Titanic. So on the Titanic, you had people in the lower, middle, and upper class. This is just based on how much you paid to be on the Titanic. And you can see that in the bar graph, it's quite clear that most people on the Titanic were in the lower class. And then the next highest category was really the upper class. You had more people in the upper class, and the middle class actually had the fewest number of passengers. On the pie chart, the difference between the middle and upper class, it can be it's almost impossible to distinguish. Yet on the bar graph, even though the middle and upper class number of counts is very similar, you can still distinguish between the two categories, meaning you can still tell that there are more people in the upper class than the middle class. The pie chart, it really kind of washes that over. This is why bar graphs are typically favored by statisticians and experts in data visualization.